in addition to the cookbook that you guys will be putting together as part of our Shakespeare unit, I'm also going to work kind of along with that, a look at how Shakespeare is very adept at developing character types. And if you think about like the totality of his plays, he wrote 37 plays, and in the course of that there's overlap between characters such as the lover, the villain, the hero, the father figure. And each of these, if you look closely at the plays and you compare early works to later works, what you begin to see is that Shakespeare is working out some ideas in his head. And we're going to focus specifically on villain characters and how Shakespeare goes from a very set format of what a villain could look like to a much more complicated, nuanced vision of that villain. So let's start things with a quotation from Rabbi Clifford LeBrock. Evil is the intense psychological preoccupation of self over and against any interest or value outside or apart, causing the deliberate infliction of unjust suffering. And I think this definition, even though LeBrock was not talking specifically about Shakespeare, I think it fits very well with our notion of the Shakespearean villain and the ideas of that ego welling up within that individual, so much so that it blocks them from any normal feelings of empathy toward other characters or other people in the play. So the value of looking at Shakespeare's characters is not so much that we want to be entertained as much as that we begin to recognize sometimes in these characters little bits and pieces of people we know, and maybe even bits and pieces of ourselves. And perhaps we can use that knowledge to either stem the flow, turn the tide, or maybe right the wrong. So one of the things I want to point out about Shakespeare's villains is that while they are exemplars of cruelty and evil, and they serve themselves much more than they serve others, Shakespeare wasn't talking about really like this kind of dichotomous relationship between good and evil. Heroes weren't all good, villains weren't all bad. Instead, I think what he was getting at is that evil exists on this kind of continuum, and there are little gradations of both good and evil in each one of us. And so when we learn to begin to study these characters and compare the behaviors, the speeches between and among these characters, we begin to see that Shakespeare's moving away from this cartoonish vision that there's good and there's evil and there's no middle room in between. I think Shakespeare's much more complex, particularly when we get to a play like Hamlet and even Macbeth, where you see that interplay, that continuum that's taking place. So what we're going to do in this brief unit is I'm going to take you through really four of these characters: Aaron the Moor, Richard III, Iago from the play Othello, and Macbeth. And then I will make mention of another two villains, Edmund from King Lear, and I'll talk specifically about Hamlet represents that continuum we talked about, where you can see good and evil housed within one individual. It's difficult to make a case that Hamlet is a pure hero, just like it's difficult to make a case that Hamlet is a pure villain, although he does contain the traits of both. So let's move now in our study of villains to some of the qualities that these villains possess. And again, these are qualities, these are suggestions, they're kind of compiled after doing a study of these major villains in his work, and then kind of getting what is the common ground that many of them have. Although all of these may not be present in one individual villain, certainly there's a piling up of multiple characteristics that we find in all the villains. So to begin with, Shakespeare's villains tend to be very subtle. They operate under subterfuge. They operate in some ways as trusted companions to other characters in the play. And their subtlety is not always recognized by people within the play, although it is recognized by us as outside readers and as an audience. His villains tend to be smart. They often are high IQ, ingenious individuals, often men, although we will find some female characters, as we might with Lady Macbeth. Particularly they're ingenious when you compare them to some of the people that they are surrounded by within their plays. by and large, what we see, whether it's Titus Andronicus and the villain of Aaron the Moor, or whether it's Hamlet, characters who are villainous tend to play roles. They like the idea of acting. And this goes along with the subtle and the subterfuge that they play. They're excellent role players, and they're excellent at deceiving, and through that deceit, manipulating the people that are their targets. Along with that, they're very skilled at presenting a false identity of themselves to the other characters, particularly to us, the audience. But because of their ego, because of their need to be like witness, they're not above pointing out to the audience through a soliloquy, pointing out to us what they're doing. So we have a wonderful example of this when we look at Richard III. It should be noted that probably one of the more horrific crimes that we have a villain commit is murder. That is such a stark, the taking of another life. We see that again and again with the villains, that they are often murderers themselves, but more often than not, they manipulate others to do their dirty work for them. They're capable of doing the crime, but they'd rather not get their hands dirty. As Shylock, who often is looked at as a villain in Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice, he points out, hates any man the thing that he would not kill. So the idea of where does this idea of murderous intent comes from? I think it's rooted in the hate that these villains feel toward others, particularly almost toward all mankind. These creatures tend to be creatures of will. They have an ambition, they have a goal, they have something that they're pursuing, and they don't mind being very cynical about that indifference that they feel towards human beings, and empathy toward those. We see this most notably in a character like Iago, and there's a speech here that's on screen that you can kind of view that we'll talk more about when we get to that study. As I mentioned earlier, the ego is very big in these characters. They are so fixated on themselves and their own power and their own ability to manipulate that it gets in the way of good judgment, or at least from the audience's point of view, their good judgment is clouded by their own ego. They themselves may not see it that way. In many ways, villains will see their evil intent, their evil machinations, as some sort of game or sport. And we'll see this particularly in a guy like Hamlet, who gets so wrapped up in this chess match that he's playing against Claudius that he forgets all decency toward other characters. It's the cleverness of the villain that seems to overtake them. It's almost like they're enamored in love with themselves, particularly their ability to play games. And this ego-centered game playing is what keeps them, in a nutshell, from being tragic figures. We don't see them as tragic, at least not the early villains. A guy like Iago does not come across as tragic, whereas someone like Macbeth might, okay? Although Macbeth lacks the game playing against anyone but himself and the supernatural witches. Something notable in many of these plays that center around villains is our villains seem to have a lack of religion. They seem to be godless for the most part. They don't seem to believe in anything but themselves and their own power to control the situation that they find themselves in, although they are often overcome by that overconfidence, overconfidence and control. A big witness to that is a character like Iago, and we'll see that as we study him. Now, one of the things to note is that Shakespeare populates even his comedies with villains, and so we get a character like Don John in Much Ado About Nothing, and instead of murder, what we exchange for there is just devilry. Often these villains are blocking agents. They're the thing that stands between happiness and the wedding in the course of true love, okay, at the end of the story. So when we're evaluating Shakespeare's evil characters, these villains, we're often left with questions at the end like why? Because in many of the plays, the villains simply don't give justification or reason to the other people in the play about why they've done what they've done. Sometimes we have characters who do bad things for good reason. Sometimes they do bad things for bad reasons, and sometimes there's absolutely no reason at all for why they do what they do. So we're left with the question, how is it that villains can be so blind to their own evil? How can they not see what they're doing to others? And so I want to further that question with some ones to consider as we go through this task. And the first one is seeking vengeance, should that be considered an evil? Even if the vengeance is over the top, even if the pursuer decides to commit wrongs that are maybe above and beyond what was done to cause the vengeance in the first place. And lastly, since many of them are unbelievers, is it possible for these unbelievers, these atheists, to truly feel guilty about what they've done if they see no repentance or redemption or silver lining at the end, some chance for heaven or hell? If they see nothingness in their future, can they ever really feel guilty? And if they can't feel guilty, are they ever reformable? And the last thing we'll look at, and this is the exercise we'll work with after our study, is I want you to see, is there a close tie between narcissism and evildoing? And is that a line we're willing to kind of cross? Can we proclaim narcissism as a type of villainy? So what I'm going to provide you with in our study, we'll look through these. I have videos prepared for each one and lectures within the school day. But your task will be to determine whether or not you see any of these villains as narcissists. And I'm going to provide to you something from the Mayo Clinic, which is basically the characteristics and qualities, the signs and systems of a narcissistic personality disorder. Now, not everyone who is a narcissist is going to be performing evil deeds, but what we see is the narcissistic personality disorder may open the door for evil doing. And so what we'll look at is take a look at some of these qualities. Again, this will be available to you through your Canvas account. And then I'll ask you to choose two of the villains that we studied specifically. And by taking a look at how they perform, how they act within the play, but then I also want to take a look at key speeches that they make, key speeches and key interchanges that they have with other characters. And through those exchanges of dialogue, I want you to see if you can identify any of these traits that are being exhibited either through the behavior or through the dialogue that's taking place. So we'll be wrapping up Shakespeare by doing our cookbook activity, but also by studying collectively this evolution of the villain character. And so again, the assignment is we'll take a look at Aaron the Moor, Iago from Othello, Richard III, Macbeth, and then I'll speak about Hamlet, although really I'm concerned with these top four in particular, as Shakespeare goes from a cartoonish villain to a much more complex villain that we see in Macbeth and Hamlet. And so you'll see how he lays the groundwork from play to play to play in building this character type.